I am going to be honest with you, and I hope you can appreciate the candor. We are looking for someone who is a better cultural fit. The woman saying this is named Sandra Whitfield. She is 51 years old. She has been the vice president of talent acquisition at Meridian Partners, a management consulting firm headquartered in a glass tower in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina for the past 7 years. She has a corner office on the 14th floor with a view of the Bank of America Stadium and a framed MBA from Duke University and a collection of leadership books on a shelf behind her desk that she has arranged by spine color rather than by content. Because Sandra Whitfield is the kind of executive who understands that appearance is architecture, that the way a thing looks is inseparable from what a thing is, and that the visual grammar of success is a language she speaks fluently and instinctively, and without the faintest awareness that it is a language at all, rather than simply the way the world works. She is sitting across a conference table from a young black woman named Elise Garner. Elise is 26 years old. She is wearing a charcoal blazer she bought at a consignment shop in Durham for $32, a white blouse her grandmother ironed that morning at 5:45, and a pair of black heels she borrowed from her cousin Tamika because her own dress shoes had a scuff on the left toe that she could not get out no matter how many YouTube tutorials she watched. Elise's resume is sitting on the table between them, printed on heavy cardstock because Elise's grandmother told her that paper quality matters, that the weight of the page tells them you are serious before they read a single word. The resume lists a degree in economics from North Carolina A&T State University, magna cum laude, a master's degree in organizational leadership from Wake Forest University, completed in 14 months on a full academic scholarship, 2 published research papers on equity frameworks in corporate hiring practices, a summer internship at Deloitte where her supervisor wrote in her evaluation that she was the most analytically gifted intern I have supervised in 11 years, and 4 letters of recommendation from faculty and professionals whose names Sandra Whitfield would recognize if she had bothered to read past the first page. Sandra did not read past the first page. Sandra looked at Elise when she walked into the conference room 43 minutes ago and made a decision that took less than 2 seconds and that she would spend the next 7 hours wishing she could unmake. In approximately 12 minutes, the door of this conference room is going to open. The person who walks through it is going to see Elise Garner sitting in a chair with her hands folded and her chin up and her eyes steady. And then that person is going to see Sandra Whitfield, and the expression on that person's face is going to tell Sandra everything she needs to know about the distance between what she has just done and what she should have done. The person who walks through that door is Dr. Catherine Hale. She is the Chief Human Resources Officer of Meridian Partners. She reports directly to the CEO. She has the authority to hire, fire, promote, and restructure any department in the company. She has been with Meridian for 22 years. She helped build the diversity and inclusion framework that Sandra Whitfield claims to uphold in every quarterly review, and she is Elise Garner's godmother. But we are not there yet. We are 12 minutes away. And in those 12 minutes, Sandra Whitfield is going to say things she cannot unsay, and Elise Garner is going to sit in a chair and absorb them with a stillness that she learned from a woman who has been absorbing worse for 67 years. And the conference room on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Charlotte is going to become, for a brief and devastating moment, a courtroom where the verdict has already been rendered and the defendant does not know it. To understand how Elise Garner ended up in that chair, you need to understand where she came from, not the university, not the scholarship, the kitchen table. A kitchen table in a small brick house on Dunbar Street in East Winston-Salem, a neighborhood that most people in Charlotte have never heard of and that most people in Winston-Salem drive past without looking. A neighborhood where the sidewalks buckle from tree roots that the city has never repaired, and the streetlights flicker because the electrical infrastructure has not been updated since 1987, and the houses are small and close together and maintained with the fierce, relentless pride of people who own what they have because they earned it with labor that left marks on their bodies. The house belongs to Elise's grandmother, Lorraine Garner. Lorraine is 67 years old. She has lived in this house for 41 years. She raised 2 children in it. She buried her husband from it. And when her daughter, Elise's mother, died of complications from lupus when Elise was 9 years old, Lorraine took Elise into it and raised her too, on a housekeeper's salary and a social security check and a stubbornness that the people who knew Lorraine described not as a personality trait, but as a geological feature, something permanent and immovable and shaped by pressures that predated memory. Lorraine Garner cleaned houses for white families in the western suburbs of Winston-Salem for 34 years. She started at 18, fresh out of high school, working for a family named Prescott, who lived in a colonial revival on a tree-lined street where the lawns were so green they looked artificial. She cleaned their bathrooms and their kitchen and their children's bedrooms and their master suite, where Mrs. Prescott left jewelry on the dresser as if testing her. And Lorraine knew it was a test because Mrs. Prescott counted the pieces every Thursday evening, and Lorraine could see the marks on the notepad where the numbers were written. Lorraine never said anything about the counting. She did not have to. The jewelry was always there, every piece, every Thursday, for 11 years, until Mrs. Prescott died and Mr. Prescott sold the house and moved to Hilton Head. And Lorraine moved on to the next family, and the family after that, and the family after that. 34 years, hundreds of toilets, thousands of loads of laundry, tens of thousands of hours spent inside homes that she could never afford, handling objects that cost more than her monthly mortgage payment, breathing air that smelled like money and entitlement and the particular fragrance of lives lived without the constant arithmetic of survival. Lorraine never complained, not because she did not feel the weight of it, but because complaint was a luxury she could not afford, the way vacations were a luxury, and new cars were a luxury, and retirement was a luxury that she understood by the time she turned 60 was never coming. She would work until she could not. Then she would stop. That was the plan. It was not a good plan. It was the only plan available. But Lorraine had a second plan, and that plan was Elise. From the moment Elise came to live with her, a 9-year-old girl carrying a garbage bag of clothes and a stuffed rabbit, and the particular silence of a child who has just watched her mother disappear into a hospital and not come back, Lorraine made a decision. This child was going to have choices. Not the choices Lorraine had, which were not choices at all, but assignments distributed by geography and race and the accident of birth. Real choices. The kind that come from education and credentials and the ability to walk into a room and know that you belong there, not because someone let you in, but because you built the door. Lorraine sat at the kitchen table with Elise every night, from 4th grade through 12th. She could not help with the calculus or the chemistry. She had not taken those courses. But she sat there. She made sure the homework was done. She checked the backpack every morning. She attended every parent-teacher conference in clothes she pressed the night before, sitting in plastic chairs designed for people half her age, asking questions that made the teachers understand that this child was not unsupervised, was not adrift, was not available for the kind of benign neglect that the system reserves for children whose advocates do not show up. Lorraine showed up. Every time, without exception. When Elise was 14, she brought home a report card with 5 A's and 1 B+ in English. And Lorraine looked at the B+ and said, "What happened?" Elise said the teacher took points off for formatting. Lorraine said, "Then next time, you format it right." There was no celebration of the 5 A's. There was no punishment for the B+. There was only the expectation, communicated not through words, but through presence, that the standard was not good enough. The standard was as good as you can be. And as good as you can be was determined not by the grade on the paper, but by the effort behind it. Elise understood. She had been raised by a woman who cleaned other people's homes with a precision that bordered on ritual, who folded towels into thirds because that was how the Prescotts wanted them, and then folded them into thirds at her own house because that was how things should be done, who ironed pillowcases, who bleached grout with a toothbrush, who understood that the quality of your work is the one thing no one can take from you, even when they take everything else. Elise absorbed this. She absorbed it the way she absorbed her mother's absence, completely and silently, converting loss into fuel without ever naming the combustion. Elise graduated valedictorian of her high school class of 312 students. She was one of 9 black students in the top 20. She received a full scholarship to North Carolina A&T, where she majored in economics because her grandmother told her that understanding money is the difference between being in a room and owning the room. And Lorraine Garner had spent 34 years being in rooms she would never own. Elise did not merely study economics, she consumed it. She was the student who sat in the front row and asked the questions that made professors pause and reconsider their own frameworks. She was the student who stayed after class, not for grades, but for understanding, who wanted to know not just what the models predicted, but why the models failed and for whom they failed, and what it meant that the failures were not random, but patterned, concentrated, predictable in their distribution across race and geography and class. By her junior year, her academic advisor told her she should consider a PhD. Elise said she did not want to study systems. She wanted to change them. She wanted to sit inside the corporations and institutions where the decisions were made and change them from within. Her advisor said that was harder than it sounded. Elise said she knew. She applied to the master's program in organizational leadership at Wake Forest University. She was accepted with a full scholarship and a research fellowship. She completed the program in 14 months, writing a thesis on equity frameworks in corporate hiring practices that was subsequently published in 2 peer-reviewed journals, one of which, the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science, described her work as a rigorous and uncomfortably precise analysis of the structural mechanisms by which implicit bias is encoded into ostensibly neutral hiring protocols. The word uncomfortably was, Elise thought, the most important word in the sentence. She was not interested in making people comfortable. She was interested in making them accurate. She sent the published papers to her grandmother. Lorraine read them at the kitchen table slowly, with a dictionary beside her for the words she did not know, which were many, and when she finished, she called Elise and said, "I do not understand all of it, but I understand enough. You wrote the truth." Elise said, "I learned that from you." Lorraine said, "You learned it from your mother." Both of them were right. When Elise applied for the Senior Organizational Development Analyst position at Meridian Partners, she did so because the role was precisely aligned with her expertise, her research, and her professional ambitions. The job description, posted on the company's website and on 3 major job boards, called for a candidate with a master's degree in organizational development, leadership, or a related field, minimum 2 years of experience in organizational consulting or human resources strategy, familiarity with diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks, strong analytical and research skills, and the ability to work collaboratively across departments. Elise met or exceeded every requirement. Her resume was submitted through the company's online portal on a Wednesday evening. She received an automated confirmation email. 3 days later, she received a message from a recruiter named Jessica, who said the hiring team had reviewed her application and would like to schedule a first-round phone screening. The phone screening lasted 22 minutes. Jessica asked standard questions about Elise's background, her interest in the role, and her salary expectations. Elise answered each one with the same precision she brought to her research: clear, specific, grounded in evidence. Jessica said she would be advancing Elise to the second round. The second round was a video interview with a panel of 3 people, 2 mid-level managers and a director. The interview lasted 45 minutes. Elise presented a case study from her graduate research, walking the panel through her methodology, her findings, and her recommendations for a hypothetical corporation implementing an equity audit. One of the panelists, a director named Mark Osman, asked her a question about measuring the ROI of diversity initiatives, a question that most candidates fumble because the metrics are genuinely complex and the literature is contested. Elise answered it by citing 3 specific studies, naming the authors and the publication years, and then offering her own critique of the methodological limitations in each, a critique she had developed in her thesis and refined through subsequent research. Mark Osman leaned back in his chair. He said, "That is the best answer I have heard to that question, and I have asked it in 40 interviews." Elise was advanced to the final round. The final round was an in-person interview at Meridian's Charlotte headquarters. The email said she would be meeting with Sandra Whitfield, Vice President of Talent Acquisition. The email said to bring a copy of her resume and to be prepared to discuss her vision for the role. The email said, "Business professional attire." Elise read the email 3 times. She prepared for 4 days. She rehearsed answers to 37 potential questions. She researched Sandra Whitfield on LinkedIn, on the company website, and in a trade publication where Sandra had been quoted about the importance of building diverse leadership pipelines. Elise read that quote twice. She printed it out and kept it in her notebook. She thought it was a good sign. The morning of the interview, Elise drove from Winston-Salem to Charlotte in Lorraine's 2011 Honda Civic, a car with 187,000 miles on the odometer and a persistent rattle in the dashboard that Lorraine had fixed 3 times and that kept coming back, like a thought that will not leave you alone. The drive took an hour and 40 minutes. Elise left at 6:15 to account for traffic. She arrived at 7:52, 8 minutes before the parking garage opened to visitors. She sat in the car and reviewed her notes. She checked her blazer in the rearview mirror. She adjusted the heels she had borrowed from Tamika. She touched the small gold stud earrings that had belonged to her mother, the only jewelry Elise's mother had owned that was worth keeping. 2 tiny gold dots that Lorraine had given to Elise on her 18th birthday in a velvet box that had once held a brooch Mrs. Prescott had donated to Goodwill. The earrings were not expensive. They were not impressive. They were her mother's. They were the closest Elise could get to bringing her mother into the room. She touched them once, lightly, the way you touch a talisman before walking into a space where you know the odds are not in your favor, but you are going anyway because the alternative is staying still. And Elise Garner did not survive everything she survived to stay still. She walked into the building at 8:12. She signed in at the lobby desk. She took the elevator to the 14th floor. She was directed to conference room 14C by a receptionist who smiled professionally and offered her water, which Elise accepted. She sat in the conference room alone for 7 minutes before Sandra Whitfield walked in. Sandra was carrying a leather portfolio and a coffee cup from a chain that Elise recognized as the one in the building's lobby, the one where a medium drip costs $4.60, a number Elise knew because she had looked at the menu while waiting and calculated that $4.60 was what Lorraine earned in approximately 23 minutes of work. Sandra sat down across from Elise. She opened the portfolio. She looked at Elise's resume for approximately 15 seconds, a duration Elise noted because she was watching Sandra's eyes and counting. Sandra looked up, she smiled, and then she began the interview that would end her career. The first 10 minutes were unremarkable. Sandra asked about Elise's academic background. Elise answered. Sandra asked about her research interests. Elise answered. Sandra asked why she was interested in Meridian Partners specifically. Elise answered, citing the company's published commitment to equity in hiring, citing the quote Sandra herself had given to the trade publication, citing the specific language in the job description that aligned with Elise's thesis work. Sandra nodded through all of this with the particular rhythm of someone who is performing listening rather than practicing it, the nod arriving at regular intervals regardless of what is being said, a metronome of professional courtesy that keeps time without keeping meaning. At the 11-minute mark, something shifted. Sandra set down her pen. She leaned back in her chair. She looked at Elise with an expression that Elise recognized immediately because she had seen it before in the guidance counselor's office in 10th grade when Mr. Henderson suggested she might want to consider a 2-year program instead of a 4-year university in the study group at Wake Forest, where a classmate assumed she was there on an athletic scholarship until Elise mentioned her research fellowship in every room where the space between what she had earned and what people assumed she deserved was wide enough to walk through without bending. Sandra said, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you will not take it the wrong way." Elise said nothing. She waited. Sandra said, "Meridian has a very specific culture. We are a close-knit team. We spend a lot of time together in client meetings, at offsites, at social events. The people who thrive here are people who fit into that environment naturally, who share our values, our communication style, our approach." Elise said, "I understand. Can you tell me more about what that culture looks like?" Sandra said, "It is hard to articulate. It is more of a feeling. You know when someone is the right fit, and you know when they are not." Elise said, "And what is your feeling about me?" Sandra paused. The pause was 3 seconds long. In those 3 seconds, the temperature in the room dropped by a degree that no thermostat could measure. Sandra said, "I am going to be honest with you, and I hope you can appreciate the candor. We are looking for someone who is a better cultural fit." Elise did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She sat in the chair her grandmother had pressed the blazer for and looked at Sandra Whitfield with the steady, leveled gaze of a woman who has been measured by the wrong instrument her entire life and has learned to hold still while the reading comes back false. She said, "Can you be more specific about what aspects of my candidacy do not fit Meridian's culture?" Sandra shifted in her seat. She said, "It is not about your qualifications. Your resume is impressive. It is about intangibles. Chemistry, the way you would integrate with the existing team." Elise said, "The existing team that you described to me in our earlier conversation as being committed to diversity and representation." Sandra said, "Diversity is important to us. Absolutely. But it is not the only factor. Elise said, "What is the other factor?" Sandra did not answer. She did not answer because there was no answer she could give that would not reveal the thing she was trying not to say, the thing she had decided in the first 2 seconds when Elise walked through the door, the thing that lived beneath the word culture and the word fit and the word intangible like a foundation no one wants to dig up because they know what is buried there. Elise watched Sandra not answer. She watched the way Sandra's hands moved to straighten papers that did not need straightening, the way her eyes dropped to the resume she had barely read, the way her body language contracted, pulling inward, protecting itself from the question it could not face. Elise said, very quietly, "I have a 4.0 undergraduate GPA. I have a master's degree on a full scholarship from a top 20 program. I have published research in 2 peer-reviewed journals on the exact subject this role addresses. I received the highest evaluation score in my internship cohort at Deloitte. I was advanced to this final interview by your own team. And you are telling me, after 11 minutes, that I am not a cultural fit. I am asking you, respectfully, to tell me what culture means in this context." Sandra's face tightened. The professional smile, the one she had maintained since she walked in, the one that functioned as both greeting and barrier, faltered. Her jaw set. Her voice, when she spoke, dropped into a register that was no longer performing warmth. She said, "Miss Garner, I have been doing this for a very long time. I know what works for this organization and what does not. I do not owe you a detailed explanation of every hiring decision. This is my professional judgment. I am sorry it is not the answer you were hoping for." Elise felt the heat, the same heat Marcus Cole felt in the dealership. The same heat every person who has ever been told they do not belong in a space their qualifications have earned them the right to enter has felt. The heat that starts in the chest and climbs toward the throat and behind the eyes. The heat that is not anger exactly, but something closer to recognition. The recognition that this moment is not new, that this is the 1,000th variation of the same encounter, that the specifics change, but the architecture does not. She thought about her grandmother, Lorraine, sitting in a plastic chair at a parent-teacher conference, wearing pressed clothes, asking questions, showing up. Lorraine, who had never once raised her voice at an employer, who had absorbed 34 years of counted jewelry and uncredited labor and the particular exhaustion of being essential and invisible at the same time, and who had done it all so that Elise could sit in this chair, in this room, on this floor of this building, and be told that she does not fit. Elise thought about her mother's earrings. She touched the left one, briefly, a gesture so small that Sandra did not notice it, but that Elise felt through her entire body, the cool metal against her fingertip, the connection to a woman who had died at 31 and left behind a 9-year-old girl and a pair of gold studs and a grandmother who decided that grief was not going to be the end of the story. Elise opened her mouth to respond. She was going to say something measured, something professional, something that would preserve her dignity without escalating the confrontation, because Elise had been trained by Lorraine Garner, and Lorraine Garner's training was clear. You do not give them the satisfaction of your anger. You give them the precision of your truth. But before Elise could speak, the door opened. The door opened inward, toward the conference table, and the woman who stepped through it was carrying a tablet in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, and was mid-sentence to someone behind her in the hallway when she turned and saw the room. She saw Sandra Whitfield on one side of the table. She saw the candidate on the other, and then she saw who the candidate was. Catherine Hale froze. The word is precise. She froze. Her body stopped moving. Her sentence stopped mid-syllable. The coffee cup halted between the doorframe and the table. Her face underwent a transformation that Sandra Whitfield would later describe in a conversation with her attorney as the moment she knew. Dr. Catherine Hale, Chief Human Resources Officer of Meridian Partners, 59 years old, 22 years with the company, architect of its diversity framework, holder of a doctorate in industrial organizational psychology from Columbia University. A woman who had been in rooms where decisions were made about the careers of thousands of people, and who had spent her professional life trying to build systems that were more fair than the ones she had inherited, looked at Elise Garner and felt two things simultaneously. The first was recognition. She had known Elise since Elise was 6 weeks old. She had been in the delivery room, not as a doctor, but as a friend, standing next to Lorraine, holding Lorraine's hand, while Elise's mother, Denise, pushed through 14 hours of labor. Catherine and Denise had been college roommates at Spelman. They had been each other's maid of honor. When Denise died, Catherine had driven from Charlotte to Winston-Salem and sat in Lorraine's kitchen for 3 days, not because there was anything useful she could do, but because sitting is sometimes the only useful thing. She had been at Elise's high school graduation. She had written one of Elise's letters of recommendation for Wake Forest. She had not known that Elise had applied to Meridian. Elise had not told her deliberately because Elise did not want the job handed to her. She wanted to earn it. She wanted to walk through the door on the strength of her resume and her research and her answers, not on the strength of a phone call from a woman who happened to be her godmother and happened to run the HR department. Elise had told Lorraine this. Lorraine had agreed. Lorraine said, "You go in there on your own 2 feet. If you are good enough, they will see it." Lorraine believed this because Lorraine had spent her entire life believing that quality speaks for itself, a belief that had sustained her through decades of evidence to the contrary, and that she held on to not because it was always true, but because the alternative, that quality does not matter, that the game is rigged, that her granddaughter's brilliance might not be enough, was a thought Lorraine could not afford to think and still get up in the morning. The second thing Catherine felt was fury, not the performative outrage of corporate accountability theater, not the calibrated concern of an HR professional managing a liability. Fury, the real thing. The kind that starts in the stomach and spreads upward like fire climbing a wall and manifests in the voice as a stillness so controlled it is more frightening than shouting. Catherine looked at Sandra. She looked at the resume on the table, the resume she recognized because she had helped Elise revise it over Thanksgiving dinner 8 months ago. The resume she knew was exceptional because she had read every line of it. She looked at Sandra's face, which was now doing the thing that faces do when they realize they have been caught, the rapid recalculation, the search for context, the desperate inventory of what was said and whether it can be reframed. Catherine set her coffee cup on the table. She set her tablet beside it. She said, "Sandra, what is happening in this room?" Sandra said, "I am conducting a final round interview." Catherine said, "I can see that. What I am asking is what you have told this candidate." Sandra's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She said, "We were just discussing the role and the candidate's fit with the organization." Catherine looked at Elise. She said, "Elise, what did she tell you?" Elise met her godmother's eyes. She saw the fury there. She saw the love beneath it. She saw the 26 years of accumulated investment, the graduation gifts and the Sunday phone calls and the recommendation letter and the Thanksgiving dinner where they had sat together at Lorraine's kitchen table, Catherine and Elise and Lorraine, 3 women spanning 3 generations and 3 different relationships to the same system, editing a resume that was going to open doors that had been closed to every generation that came before. Elise said, "She told me I am not a cultural fit." She said it after 11 minutes. She did not ask me a single question about my research, my published work, or my experience at Deloitte. She did not ask me about the case study I prepared. She told me the decision was based on intangibles and chemistry. She was not able to specify what those intangibles were when I asked. Catherine turned to Sandra. The turn was slow, deliberate, the way a judge turns toward a defendant. She said, "Sandra, are you aware of who this candidate is?" Sandra said, "She is Elise Garner. She applied through the standard portal." Catherine said, "She is the most qualified candidate I have seen for this role in the 4 years it has been posted. She is also my goddaughter, though that is not relevant to her qualifications, and she deliberately chose not to disclose that relationship because she wanted to be evaluated on her merits, which, based on what I am hearing, she was not." Sandra Whitfield's face lost its remaining color. Not gradually, all at once, the way a screen goes dark when the power cuts. She looked at Elise. She looked at Catherine. She looked at the resume on the table, the resume she had spent 15 seconds reviewing, the resume that represented 26 years of survival and sacrifice and relentless, compounding effort, and she understood in a single clarifying instant that the decision she had made in 2 seconds was going to take considerably longer to undo. Catherine did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said, "Sandra, I would like you to step out of this room. I'm going to continue this interview personally. We will discuss your conduct afterward." Sandra stood. Her chair scraped against the floor. She gathered her portfolio and her coffee cup, and she walked to the door with the particular gait of someone who knows they are being watched and is trying to project composure while their internal architecture collapses. She did not look at Elise as she passed. She did not say goodbye. She opened the door and walked through it, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded, in the silence of the conference room, like a period at the end of a sentence. Catherine sat down in the chair Sandra had vacated. She placed her hands flat on the table. She looked at Elise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was the silence of two people who share a history deep enough that words are sometimes unnecessary. The silence of a godmother looking at a young woman she has watched grow from a 6-week-old infant into someone who just sat in a chair and absorbed a rejection she did not deserve, with a composure that would have made Lorraine proud. Catherine said, "Are you okay?" Elise said, "I am fine." Catherine recognized the answer. It was a Garner answer. Fine meant functional. Fine meant upright. Fine meant the damage is real, but I am not going to let you see it until I am alone. And even then, I might not let myself see it, because the Garner women process pain by converting it into motion, and I do not have time to be still right now. Catherine said, "I want you to know that what happened in this room is not acceptable, and it is not reflective of the organization I have spent 22 years building. I also want you to know that I am not going to give you this job because of what just happened. I'm going to give you a fair interview, the one you should have received, and if you are the best candidate, which I strongly suspect you are, you will be offered the position on the strength of your qualifications." "Is that acceptable to you?" Elise said. "That is all I have ever asked for." Catherine opened her tablet. She pulled up the interview protocol, the same structured interview guide that every final round candidate was supposed to receive, the guide that Sandra Whitfield had apparently discarded after 15 seconds. She began the interview. It lasted 1 hour and 14 minutes. Elise presented her case study. She answered questions about organizational development theory, change management frameworks, DEI metrics, stakeholder engagement strategies, and the specific challenges of implementing equity audits in mid-sized consulting firms. She cited her research by page number. She referenced 3 specific Meridian client cases that she had studied during her preparation, identifying gaps in their published approaches and suggesting modifications based on her own analytical framework. Catherine, who had conducted hundreds of interviews in her career, who had a doctorate in the science of evaluating human potential in organizational contexts, who had literally written the company's interview rubric, scored Elise a 94 out of 100, the highest score in the 4-year history of the position. When the interview concluded, Catherine closed her tablet. She looked at Elise. She said, "Off the record, and as your godmother, your mother would be so proud of you that she would not be able to breathe." Elise's composure, the composure she had maintained through Sandra's dismissal and the confrontation and the full interview, cracked, not broke, cracked. The way a dam cracks when the pressure behind it exceeds the structural capacity of stillness. A single tear ran down her left cheek. She wiped it with the back of her hand. She said, "I know." Then she straightened her blazer, the $32 consignment blazer that Lorraine had pressed that morning at 5:45, and she said, "Thank you for the interview, Dr. Hale." Catherine said, "Thank you for not giving up." Elise said, "That was never an option." She touched her mother's earring again, the left one, the gold stud that cost less than the coffee Sandra Whitfield was drinking. And she stood up, and she walked out of the conference room on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Charlotte, North Carolina, and she took the elevator down to the lobby, and she walked through the glass doors into the October sunlight, and she sat in her grandmother's 2011 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles on the odometer and a rattle in the dashboard, and she called Lorraine. Lorraine answered on the second ring, the way she always does, because Lorraine Garner does not let a phone ring 3 times when her granddaughter is on the other end. Elise said, "Grandma, I got the interview. The real one." Lorraine said, "I know you did." Elise said, "It was hard." Lorraine said, "The ones that matter always are." Elise said, "She told me I did not fit." Lorraine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, you do not fit. You were never supposed to fit. Fitting means making yourself smaller so the room does not have to get bigger. You are not small. You have never been small. Let them build a bigger room. Elise cried, properly this time, not the single disciplined tear of the conference room, the full, heaving, uncontrolled cry of a 26-year-old woman who has carried the weight of her mother's death and her grandmother's sacrifice and her own relentless excellence for so long that the muscles holding it all in place are exhausted, and the only honest response to being told, "You do not belong in a room you were born to lead," is to sit in a parking garage in a borrowed pair of heels and let the grief and the rage and the love pour out. She cried for 4 minutes. Lorraine stayed on the line. She did not say, "It is okay." It was not okay. She said, "I am here." That was enough. It was always enough. Sandra Whitfield was terminated from Meridian Partners 11 days after the interview. The termination was not immediate because corporate investigations, even when the conclusion is obvious, follow protocols that are designed to protect the company from the legal consequences of acting too quickly. Catherine Hale recused herself from the investigation due to her personal relationship with Elise, a decision that cost her significant emotional energy, but that she understood was necessary to ensure the process could withstand scrutiny. The investigation was conducted by Meridian's outside employment counsel and the VP of Internal Audit. They reviewed the interview recordings. The conference room had cameras that recorded audio and video for quality assurance purposes, a fact that Sandra apparently forgot or never knew. They reviewed Sandra's interview notes, which consisted of the candidate's name, the date, and the phrase "not right for team," 3 words that would become the centerpiece of a formal finding of discriminatory conduct. They reviewed the interview scores from the first 2 rounds, which were uniformly excellent. They reviewed the structured interview protocol and confirmed that Sandra had not followed it. They interviewed Derek, the recruiter who had advanced Elise, and Mark Osman, the director who had described her answer as the best he had heard in 40 interviews. Both expressed confusion about the rejection. Mark Osman said, in a statement that was included in the investigation file, "I advanced this candidate specifically because I thought she was exceptional. If she was rejected at the final stage, I would want to understand why, because nothing in her performance warranted it." The investigation concluded that Sandra Whitfield had failed to follow the company's structured interview protocol, had made a hiring determination based on subjective and non-job-related criteria, and had engaged in conduct inconsistent with Meridian's published commitment to equitable hiring practices. The termination letter used the phrase "violation of company policy." It did not use the word "discrimination." Corporate termination letters rarely do. The word carries legal weight that companies prefer to avoid, not because the conduct does not meet the definition, but because the definition, once invoked, creates obligations that extend beyond the individual and into the system that enabled them. Sandra Whitfield cleaned out her office on a Friday afternoon when most of the floor was in a client meeting. She carried 2 boxes to her car, a silver Lexus parked in the executive section of the garage. She did not say goodbye to her team. She did not post a statement on LinkedIn. She did not, as far as anyone could determine, contact Elise Garner to apologize. She disappeared from the professional landscape of Charlotte the way a stone disappears into water, the surface closing over the disturbance until, within weeks, the only evidence that she had been there at all was the ripple pattern she left behind. The ripple pattern was considerable. A colleague of Sandra's at Meridian, a mid-level manager named Jennifer Caulfield, had been in the hallway when Sandra walked out of the conference room after Catherine's intervention. Jennifer had heard enough through the partially open door to understand what had happened. She told a colleague. That colleague told 2 others. By the end of the day, the story had circulated through the 14th floor with the efficiency of an internal memo and the emotional charge of a detonation. Within a week, it had spread beyond the building. A former Meridian employee posted an anonymized account on a professional networking forum, describing the incident in enough detail that people within the industry could identify the company. The post was shared, it was discussed, it was debated, with a predictable distribution of responses. Some people expressed outrage, some people said the story was exaggerated, some people said that cultural fit is a legitimate hiring criterion and that the incident was being weaponized by people with an agenda. Some people, a distressing number, said that Sandra Whitfield was being punished for doing her job, that assessing fit is subjective by nature, and that the involvement of the CHRO's goddaughter created a conflict of interest that invalidated the entire investigation. Elise did not engage with any of this. She did not post about the experience. She did not comment on the forum threads. She did not respond to the 3 reporters who contacted her through LinkedIn asking for an interview. She told Lorraine about the online discussion. Lorraine said, "The internet is a room full of people who were not in the room. They do not know what they are talking about. Ignore them." Elise ignored them. She had work to do. Because 3 weeks after the interview, Elise Garner received a formal offer letter from Meridian Partners for the position of Senior Organizational Development Analyst. The offer included a starting salary of $92,000, a signing bonus of $8,000, full benefits, and a professional development stipend that would allow her to attend 2 industry conferences per year. The letter was signed by the CEO. Catherine Hale's name was not on it, by design. Elise read the letter at the kitchen table in Lorraine's house on Dunbar Street. Lorraine was sitting across from her, in the same chair where she had sat for 17 years of homework supervision, wearing a house dress and slippers, and the reading glasses she bought at the dollar store because she refuses to spend money on frames when the lenses are what matter. Elise slid the letter across the table. Lorraine read it. She read it twice. She looked at the salary figure. She looked at the signing bonus. She looked at the signature line. Then she looked at Elise, and her face did something that Lorraine Garner's face almost never does. It softened completely. The architecture of endurance, the set jaw, and the steady eyes, and the pressed lip composure that had carried Lorraine through 34 years of other people's houses and 17 years of raising a grandchild alone, relaxed. She looked, for a moment, not like a woman who had survived, but like a woman who had arrived. She said, $92,000. Elise said, "Yes, ma'am." Lorraine said, "That is more than I made in 3 years." Elise said, "I know." Lorraine said, "Your mother would not believe it." Elise said, "She would believe it. She would say she always knew." Lorraine nodded. She folded the letter carefully, precisely, the way she folds everything, and she handed it back to Elise. She said, "You framed that. You put it on the wall. And every morning when you walk past it, you remember that a woman named Sandra Whitfield looked at you for 2 seconds and decided you did not belong. And then you remember that you belong anyway. Not because she said so, because you earned it." Elise took the letter. She drove back to Durham, where she was renting a 1-bedroom apartment near the university. She stopped at a frame shop on the way. She chose a simple black frame, $14. She hung the letter on the wall next to her desk, next to her diplomas, next to a photograph of her mother holding her at 6 weeks old in a hospital room where Catherine Hale was standing in the background, smiling, not yet knowing that the infant in the photograph would one day sit in a conference room in her building and be told she did not fit. Elise started at Meridian Partners on a Monday in November. Her first day was unremarkable in the way that first days are supposed to be unremarkable. Orientation materials, IT setup, introductions to colleagues who smiled and shook her hand and showed her where the coffee machine was and which printer jammed less frequently. No one mentioned Sandra Whitfield. No one mentioned the interview. The story existed in the building's institutional memory the way a repaired crack exists in a foundation, visible if you know where to look, but covered by new paint and new carpet and the daily traffic of people who have moved on. Elise had not moved on. She did not expect to. Moving on is what people who were not in the room tell you to do because the discomfort of your memory makes their present tense less comfortable. Elise was not interested in making anyone comfortable. She was interested in doing the work. And the work, as it turned out, was exactly what she had spent her entire academic career preparing for. Within her first 90 days, Elise conducted a comprehensive audit of Meridian's hiring practices across all 4 of its regional offices. She analyzed 3 years of interview data, cross-referencing candidate demographics with advancement rates, interviewer scoring patterns, and the language used in rejection notes. She found what her published research had predicted she would find: patterns. Not random, not accidental, not attributable to individual bias alone, but embedded in the structure of the process itself, in the interview rubrics that weighted subjective criteria like presence and polish, alongside objective criteria like qualifications and experience, in the scoring norms that allowed evaluators to reject candidates for intangible reasons without documentation, in the feedback templates that provided language like not the right fit without requiring specificity. She found that Black and Latino candidates were 37% more likely to be rejected at the final interview stage than white candidates with comparable qualifications. She found that the word fit appeared in 61% of rejection notes for candidates of color and in 14% of rejection notes for white candidates. She found that Sandra Whitfield was not an anomaly. She was a data point, a consistent, predictable, structurally produced data point in a system that generated Sandra Whitfield's the way a factory generates product, not through malice, but through design. Elise presented her findings to the executive leadership team in a 90-minute presentation that included 37 slides, 4 data visualizations, and a 12-point recommendation framework for restructuring the company's hiring process. Catherine Hale was in the room. The CEO was in the room. The general counsel was in the room. Elise stood at the front of a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Charlotte and showed a room full of executives the architecture of their own bias. She did it with data. She did it with precision. She did it wearing the same gold stud earrings her mother had worn. She did not mention Sandra Whitfield by name. She did not need to. The data mentioned her. The patterns mentioned her. The 61% mentioned her. When Elise finished, the room was quiet. The CEO said, "How quickly can we implement these changes?" Elise said, "I have a timeline prepared." The CEO said, "Send it to me today." Catherine Hale, sitting in the back of the room, did not speak. She did not need to. She watched her goddaughter stand at the front of a room she had been told she did not belong in and redesign it. She thought about Denise. She thought about Lorraine. She thought about the 6-week-old infant in the hospital photograph. And she understood, with the clarity that comes from 22 years of trying to change systems from within, that the most powerful thing she had ever done for this company was not write a policy or design a framework or chair a committee. It was stand in a delivery room and hold Lorraine's hand while a woman named Denise brought a girl into the world who would one day walk into a room and refuse to leave it smaller than she found it. Have you ever been in a room where someone decided you did not fit before you opened your mouth, before you showed them what you knew, before you had the chance to demonstrate the years of work and sacrifice and preparation that brought you to that chair in that room on that day? If you have, then you know that the word fit is not a measurement. It is a mirror. It reflects the assumptions of the person using it, not the qualifications of the person it is aimed at. When Sandra Whitfield said Elise Garner was not a cultural fit, she was not describing Elise. She was describing herself. She was describing a template she carried so deep inside her professional identity that she could not distinguish it from judgment, a template that sorted human beings into categories based on signals that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with comfort. The comfort of familiarity, the comfort of sameness, the comfort of looking across a conference table and seeing someone who looks like the people who have always been there. Elise Garner did not look like the people who had always been there. She looked like a woman from Dunbar Street in a consignment blazer and borrowed heels and her dead mother's earrings. And Sandra Whitfield could not see past the looking to the being, could not see the magna cum laude and the full scholarship and the published research and the 94 out of 100, because the template was doing the seeing for her, and the template had been installed so long ago and reinforced so consistently that Sandra did not know it was there. This is not an excuse. It is a diagnosis. And the treatment is not a training seminar or a policy memo or a corporate statement that uses the words deeply committed to diversity. The treatment is the willingness to look at the template and say, this is mine, I built it, I maintained it, I used it, and I was wrong. Sandra Whitfield never said those words, not publicly, not privately, not in the investigation, not in the termination meeting. She left Meridian Partners the way she had left the conference room, without looking at the person she had harmed, without acknowledging the damage, without the vocabulary of accountability, because accountability requires a fluency she had never been asked to develop. The system that produced Sandra Whitfield did not require her to be accountable. It required her to be effective. And she was effective for 19 years at sorting people into categories and calling it professional judgment. Elise Garner is at Meridian Partners today. She was promoted within her first year. She now leads the company's equity auditing practice, a department that did not exist before she arrived. She has trained over 200 hiring managers in structured interview techniques. She has redesigned the company's rejection protocols to require specific, documented, job-related justification for every candidate declined at the final stage. The word fit no longer appears in Meridian's evaluation rubrics. It was removed on Elise's recommendation in her first quarterly report, with a footnote that cited her own published research and included a single sentence that read, "Subjective assessments of organizational fit have been shown to function as proxies for demographic bias in 73% of analyzed cases, and their removal from structured evaluation processes reduces discriminatory outcomes by an average of 41% without negatively impacting higher quality or retention." The footnote was clinical. The woman who wrote it was not. She wrote it at the kitchen table on Dunbar Street, sitting across from Lorraine, who was watching a cooking show with the volume low. She wrote it wearing her mother's earrings. She wrote it on a laptop she bought with her signing bonus, a laptop she keeps in a bag next to a velvet box that once held a brooch Mrs. Prescott donated to Goodwill and that now holds 2 gold studs that are worth less than a cup of coffee and more than everything Sandra Whitfield owned in that conference room, because they carry the weight of a woman who did not live long enough to see her daughter walk into a room and refuse to leave it, and a woman who has lived long enough to see it and who sits across the table, folding the truth into thirds, the way she folds everything, because that is how things should be done.